I think a lot of people not in the energy space, especially, but even some in the energy space, look at emerging technologies and are looking only for a silver bullet, an all encompassing solution to the energy problem, whether that is fusion or now, fission. Traditional nuclear is getting a lot more play. Or whether it's hydrogen to some people, everyone has this idea about something that can solve all of our energy problems. But the truth is that the energy landscape is far too dynamic for that. And only a multifaceted, like encompassing and integrated set of solutions is the way to answer these questions that have cropped up today and are becoming more and more urgent.
Welcome to the Blue Ocean Solutions podcast, where we dive into real conversations with business owners, innovators, and industry leaders reshaping the future of clean tech, construction, and the renewable energy sectors. I'm Kreel Hutchinson, your host. Our podcast guest today is Aaron Goodman, the founder and CEO of Petra Power in the Cleveland, Ohio area. Today, we're going to discuss his journey from plasma physics to pioneering a revolutionary electrochemical device that's changing how we generate power and the strategic shifts his company is making to bridge the gap to a resilient energy future. If you're a founder in renewable energy, clean technology, or heavy industrial sectors, you will love this show because Aaron shows and shares his invaluable insights into scaling deep tech, navigating market shifts, and practical applications of advanced science to real-world energy challenges. It's an example of how visionary leadership and cutting-edge innovation are driving the next generation of sustainable power solutions. Welcome to the podcast, Aaron.
Thanks for having me, Kreel. Glad to be here.
For people that may not be familiar with your work, why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, your role, and what you're currently up to?
Yeah, happy to. So, as you mentioned, my name is Aaron Goodman. I'm the CEO and founder here at Petra Power. I come from a very energy-focused background, and I also have been kind of starting companies since I was a high schooler. And from a position of intellectual curiosity, I kind of have been into physics and chemistry for all that time as well. And, went on to get my PhD at Princeton in nuclear fusion or plasma physics with the idea that, fusion was the answer to kind of a lot of the energy problems that I had been focused on for most of my life. And, the reason that I kind of got interested in energy originally was it just seemed so obvious to me years ago, it still is today, that energy is the underpinning of kind of all of the things that we want in the world. It's the seminal problem of our time. It maybe started from the perspective of energy transition, in the sense that, we looked around the turn of the decade, the last decade, 2010, we looked at where we were at in an energy production paradigm and saw that there was a level of unsustainability to it, just in terms of long-term growth, even before other considerations. We're now looking at the real implications of that because we live in a world today, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more as we go forward, but we live in a world today where energy abundance and availability is the constraint on new industry. It's a constraint on developing nations, and even in developed nations like the United States here, the need for more energy abundance in industrial sectors is driving prices up for individuals, and without novel solutions or new approaches to this problem, will eventually curtail access, even for the normal everyday citizens. And so this continues to be the most pressing issue of our time. Everything else that we want really flows down from energy availability. And I was really driven to try to find a solution. My hope was, and I think still is, but now on a very different timeline, that fusion is a very encompassing answer to that problem. My experience in getting a PhD was that we weren't addressing this issue in a way that was going to drive rapid adoption. And that's kind of what drove me to go build Petra Power, was this idea that we needed solutions that could make market impact, that could make availability and emission impact and livability impact immediately. And that's really what's at the core of our technology. And kind of in a second layer, there is this idea that I think a lot of people not in the energy space, especially, but even some in the energy space, look at emerging technologies and are looking only for a silver bullet, an all-encompassing solution to the energy problem, whether that is fusion or now, fission. traditional nuclear is getting a lot more play, or whether it's hydrogen to some people. Everyone has this idea about something that can solve all of our energy problems. But the truth is that the energy landscape is far too dynamic for that. And only a multifaceted, like encompassing and integrated set of solutions is the way to answer these questions that have cropped up today and are becoming more and more urgent. And we really see Petra Power's technology at the nexus of those solutions as providing a portion of the pie, but then also enabling the deployment of all the other solution sets or asset classes that are needed to really comprehensively bring our energy production out of the industrial revolution. We're using better turbines and generators than we ever have today, but that's still very 1800s coded technology. And it's really time that we brought power generation, electricity generation into the 21st century. And that's what we're all about here at Petra Power.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's been a big theme on the podcast, speaking to a wide range of guests, is really this idea of all hands on deck. And you mentioned it there yourselves, of being diversified in our energy. Rather than trying to pick one, maybe one winner from even an administrative or government side, really we need to be exploring all of these potential solutions and seeing what really works best. So you highlight that there. I also want to comment that I'm impressed at you as an individual, because you went from a very academic background and then transitioned into a business owner and being an entrepreneur, which I'm sure it's like wearing two very different hats. When you look at like a team, usually you have different people in those roles, but seeing your arc from academic to entrepreneurship and really bringing that all together in Petra Power, I'd love for you to explain. Let's get into exactly what Petra Power, what you're doing there with your team, and you can give a little bit of context, when it was created, how big your team is, so that the audience has a bit of an understanding or context.
Yeah, so I guess first, this wasn't your direct question, but I always have known that I was going to end up building something, whether that's hubris or determination. I guess depends on your perspective. But I started my first company in high school. I had a somewhat successful company in college, and then this is just the next evolution of that. That now, to answer your question, I ended up starting actually during my PhD program, born out of this kind of frustration that I was seeing in the department about the lack of applicability or market drive for fusion development. And so, we have a very unique story here at Petra Power, and I'll kind of walk through it and then get into where we're at today. But we originally licensed our technology from NASA Glenn, that's right up here by us in Cleveland. And they had originally invented the technology for manned spaceflight. And it's just a massive step forward in the major barriers that electrochemical devices have had from reaching widespread adoption, especially in power generation versus power storage, since batteries are also electrochem devices. Those big barriers are cost, lifetime, and fuel tolerance. And I'll talk more about those since they underpin all the work we do here. But we licensed that technology and started the company up while I was in my PhD program, so around 2018. And it was a really long slog to get to the point where we were actually able to do meaningful work. And I think that this chasm between having, in some people's cases, it's having a great idea. They've invented some technology that they want to bring to market. In our case, we had a great technology that somebody else had invented that we knew was ready for market adoption. But getting to the point where you can actually take a patent or a set of patents in our case, or a great idea, and turn it into something physical. This is very unique to the hardware space. The software space, very different. That chasm is one that is largely unsolved. We are a very small minority case that was able to make it through about 5 years until we got 4.5 until we got funding. And making it through that, well, it's one of a few valleys of death that startups and especially hardware startups face. But that's a very unique set of circumstances. And it took a lot of determination. It took a lot of rejection and fumbling through in the darkness. I've heard people describe critical kind of qualities for founders to have as being comfortable in the uncomfortable. And that, I think, is very true in this situation where are we putting our own money into the company? And am I doing a full PhD program and also working close to 40 hours a week trying to build the company for nothing because we're never going to be able to actually go do the hard work and buy the heavy equipment that we need and all these things? But you just have to be comfortable in that space and keep being driven by the principles that are important to you and that drove you to build whatever you're building in the first place. And we were fortunate that that doggedness eventually led to an opportunity to do some work with the DoD, now DoW. And that's really how we got our start. So we started working with the DoD at the time, February of 2023. And that's really where I consider the start of the company, so to speak, because that's where we went from part-time putting our own money in and there was not a lot of money behind this. I'll tell you that, certainly on my end. And if people know what PhD students get paid, it's less than minimum wage. And so there wasn't really a lot of money to go around. But that kind of shift around February of 23 was our opportunity to go take a bite at the apple and give this a real run. And so, I don't want to downplay the hard work that went into it. It was so many proposals. It was so many conversations. It was so much networking to get to the right people. But it's also a bit of luck, right? We ended up in the right place at the right time in the right environment here in Northeast Ohio, which was and still is giving a lot of attention to economic development. And that's kind of how we got our breakthrough. From there, that's where a lot of the fun starts. And so from that period in February of 2023, we've grown from 2 to 14 full-time employees. We've gone from truly patent without anything behind it to full systems that will be deployed into the real world this year. Just are closing our first venture round right now as well to tack on to the 9 million that we've had from the DOW. And being able to reach those points, there's a lot of execution along the way, which I'm sure we'll also talk about, but it never happens if we don't fight through the uncertainty and the lack of support truly that exists for very, very early stage hardware ventures, especially when the road ahead of them is long and capitally intense. So non-dilutive sources of federal funding have a role to play in that, but right now they're the only option really for most people, unless you're like a repeat founder and everyone knows you and you can just go talk to your VC buddies. That's a totally different space. But for folks like me who were kind of fresh out of academia, done some stuff before but never venture backed, that's the only tool right now. And I think that there's an opportunity in the market for someone to step in and fill a different form of that gap. That's a different topic altogether, but is certainly something I feel passionately about. So yeah, that's a lot of our background.
Yeah, fantastic. I commend you for going through all, it sounds like from 2018 to 2023 was in the trenches. So that's a lot of years to put in the energy and the effort and work. And then you also had mentioned there was a little bit of luck along the way. And I want to tie that to potentially, my assumption would be luck comes in a form where you've earned it, but also what were the unique circumstances? Maybe it was trends, maybe it was changes in the marketplace or changes in the unforeseen that allowed those kind of doorways to start opening up. What were some of those trends that allowed you to push you in the right direction past 2023?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to your first point, I've heard people say that luck is opportunity meeting preparation. And so from that perspective, that is what we had. We had a lot of preparation and then we finally found the opportunity. And to the main question, what factors drove the opportunity to exist at that point that hadn't previously? Certainly a component of it is electrification. Electrification as a concept is something that we don't talk really about as much anymore. But if you look at the trend lines, it's on the same pace it was the last time we were talking about it, which was like 2019. But that last time that we were talking about it around 2019 was when we started to see some traction in these conversations, because through this lens of electrification, we started to see people recognize that, hey, if things continue down this path, we'll need to add more grid capacity than we're currently capable of. And now the rise of data centers and AI, the electrification of heavy industry, which is relatively new, has only accelerated those trends and has created a different layer of opportunity that's probably 2 orders of magnitude greater than it was at the time. But that's probably what opened the door first for us. And then that factor met the confluence of economic development engine here in Northeast Ohio, which again, I will give credit for driving a lot of the introductions that eventually got us to the right people to make our pitch for how we can really provide value to the DoD, DoW. And then it was more hard work, right? To line up what the proposal would look like and find a good partner. Because as many know, a company of our size can't be a prime contractor for the DoD, DoW, so you need a prime on the contract as well. And I think that any one of those elements helped open the door, but it was really the confluence of those things that gave us the opportunity to secure this first contract. And then it was our performance that secured us the second contract.
Perfect. If you could explain to the audience, what is the value proposition that Petra Power really brings that, catches people's attention and continues to allow you to accelerate in this growth?
Yeah. For many, many years, the value proposition was very straightforward in terms of what was most important, because there's a whole slew of values and can't overwhelm people. It was as simple as we're always going to be at least 2 times more efficient than a combustion engine, because as opposed to combustion, which converts fuel to heat and heat to electricity, and there's loss along the way, and there's fundamental physics limitations, there's a Carnot limit to all of these things. We do direct electrical conversion. And so there's no loss in those steps. And we have different fundamental limits. We're governed by Gibbs free energy versus a Carnot limit. And so we're always going to be more efficient, which means lower costs to produce electricity. And that's always going to be an important driver. We're also silent, odorless, vibration free, which matters in some markets and does not matter in others. But I say all of that as historical because while all of that is still true, today we live in a different environment. Today, if you want to go buy a turbine that's in the megawatt class, you're probably waiting 7 years or more. If you want to go buy a large generator, you're probably waiting 3 to 5 years. It's those bottlenecks today that no one can overcome. Even advanced technologies, linear generators and repurposing aircraft turbines, which is something that's going on quite a bit right now, they still have these fundamental limitations because they're driven by downstream components like blades and vanes and alternators and shafts that every combustion-based system requires. But we don't, because we don't convert heat to electricity. So now we still need to tell that story about how we're going to be better in the long run. We're fuel flexible, so we can take nat gas and diesel and hydrogen one day, but it's also availability. So, we don't yet produce megawatt class systems because we're in a tiny startup facility here, and that's a real undertaking, but I can still deliver them faster than anybody else can because we're not bottlenecked by fundamental components. And so today, the value proposition just continues to expand. And as the need for energy continues to grow, which it's accelerating at an unprecedented rate, those pressures on the market that are creating the bottlenecks get stronger and our value gets more evident. And so we really are sitting today at the precipice of a generational opportunity in power, where if you have a solution that can deploy rapidly, that can scale to meet the not just megawatt, but multiple gigawatt needs of the market, you can win more quickly and more easily. You can garner more attention than you ever have been able to do before. And we're really just scratching the surface of that. We're really just starting our journey down that road.
Your clear value proposition there sounds almost like a no-brainer that I'm sure there's an increasing appetite from both government and the private sector to explore these ideas. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that interestingly, in kind of some of the most urgent markets, and those really are data centers, who every new data center build has an on-site power plant. It's behind the meter. They put it in what's called the gray zone, but everybody's doing this right now. And it's interesting because the kind of lack of options has driven interest in a way that it's never been before. But simultaneously, the urgency of the problem has created sales cycle challenges, because it's very hard for a data center operator today to have a conversation with you if you're not literally ready to go set something up on site, because it's such an urgent issue. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword here, which requires some creative navigation of the market, let's say. But it is true that in the macro sense, the demand for power, the frequency of power being included in federal calls and federal priorities, the increasing awareness of shortages in the grid and our ability to add grid capacity, in the interplay between heavy industrial electricity demand and residential electricity prices. These are complicated topics that people may not fully grasp today, but are being forced into the public consciousness, whether people want it or not, because of how acute and how prescient the issue is. And so it is really a unique time for everyone making power, but especially for us because we're doing it in such a fundamentally different way.
What are some of the major challenges or bottlenecks that you see that is stopping kind of like your go-to-market strategy and getting more of this adoption out there?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I'd say the major one is this interplay between great demand and very urgent need. And so, if I go and I talk to OpenAI today, there's an interest in what we're doing, but there's a lack of willingness to commit significant time to something that can't be set up on site today because they need 10 gigawatts in the next 6 months. And for what we're building today, which is like call it 100 kilowatt class and below, um, we're just not going to be able to deliver that to them. And so they know that we can scale to meet this demand long term, but we're not necessarily able to deliver today. And that's where things have to get a little creative. I'd say for us, the secondary challenge is that we just quite frankly need to scale. And so that starts with our real world deployments that'll happen this year. It starts with increasing the automation in our facility, which will happen this year as well. And then it's all about execution from there. So scaling up, delivering more units, more hours in service in the field. And those are a lot of the product-based milestones that our customers really need to see to be comfortable deploying 5, 10, hundreds of megawatts.
I see. With Petra Power, as you guys aim to bridge the gap in the, let's say, the resilient fuel economy, how do you plan to communicate this unique advantage to your to the marketplace so that they become more familiar with it and show the how really it's much more effective than, say, past technologies that people might have a hangover of thinking that it's somewhat similar to what we've seen in the past? How do you plan to educate the communities and government and the public in order to be more receptive to these ideas?
That's also an interesting question. The truth is that we are a little bit different in the way that we approach that type of question. We have a ton of value in terms of fuel flexibility, in terms of electrolysis, which I never talk about, in terms of our ability to bridge the gap between what people use today and what we expect them to use in the future. But most of those values are a distraction from what the market needs the most right now. And so, quite frankly, we believe that the best way to drive a lot of those things that we feel are important, distributed power, certainly on that list as well, is to be market facing and market reactive to try to meet the needs of the market where they are. And today that's largely natural gas, a little bit of diesel, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then with widespread adoption already in place, that's really where we have the opportunity to then start educating our customers of, hey, if you wanted to switch over to biomass or hydrogen on this existing Petra Power unit that you're operating, you don't need to do anything. It's already set up for that. And so if that becomes available and cost effective to you, just know that you don't need to buy new hardware. You've already got what you need. And to us, that's kind of the best way to drive that. Where the fuel flexibility does come in today is that if you take a defense operation, for example, they're trying to use JP8, which is military jet fuel effectively, for almost everything that they do. But in an increasingly uncertain war theater, let's call it, there's no longer the same level of certainty to what types of fuels will be available. So the ability to flex into diesel or flex into propane is extremely valuable for operational readiness and flexibility. On the data center side, they're using natural gas as their primary power source, and that's what we're servicing. But they're keeping diesel on site as a backup fuel source. And so they also need diesel generators to cover that diesel load if the nat gas pipeline goes down. Well, hey, now we have your integrated solution. So if the nat gas pipeline goes down, keep the system running and just start feeding it diesel, and it's going to produce the same power that you need. That's a huge value in terms of risk mitigation and limiting capital costs, and really is amplified by the fact that it's so hard to get all these components now. So now it's hard to get turbines and generators. Well, you don't have to worry about either of those now because you can get one system faster than either one of those that does.
As you in 2026 take it to the marketplace and you have more hours in service in the field, as you described earlier, what do you think would be the determining factor if you could wave one magic wand that instantly automates some aspect of Petra Power's operations? What would it be, and how would it be able to affect your scalability throughout 2026 and beyond?
Today, we don't have automation. It was outside the scope of the DoD work we were doing. It was part of what we will do with this round that we're just closing on. And so it's a big priority for us in 26. The reason for that is because right now, labor is our limiting factor, quite frankly. It limits our throughput. It's the driver of our cost. By automating these manufacturing processes that we have, which are commercial, right? We're not reinventing the wheel here, which is also very critical. Usually, advanced electrochemical devices like ours have very bespoke, like unique aspects to them that no one's ever automated before, and it's this huge process. We're not in that boat, and that's by design. Again, because we focus on practicality, deliverability, speed to deployment, cost of manufacturing, all of these different elements. And so by automating these things, not only will we increase our throughput, will we decrease our product costs significantly, but we'll also free up our incredibly talented team to go solve even harder problems, to go make a product that already looks incredible, look truly indistinguishable from magic because it's doing so much with so little. And that's an unlock that is hard to quantify today. It's much easier to quantify the throughputs and the costs, but it's something that I expect to have compounding effects when we free up our team to stop doing the hands-on work and to start doing the hard and exciting work of continuing to push us forward.
Awesome. As you automate, let's say in a perfect world, this continues to improve, as I'm sure it will. So you automate manufacturing, your speed to deployment improves, then you're able to take it to the marketplace in a more effective and efficient way. Who would be some of your ideal customer profiles that you'd be discussing? Like you're working with the DOW already, but beyond that, where could you see this technology and what are the conversations with what type of companies or groups would you love to be having in order to really, start to scale beyond 26 into, the rest of this decade?
Yeah, so as I said at the top, we replace turbines and generators. So anywhere you see a turbine or a generator, that's a good place for us to slot in, or 99% of those are great places for us to slot in. And that makes our customers kind of everybody. It's utilities, it's residential, it's commercial, it's industrial, it's vehicles. There's a lot of opportunity here. And we really do see ourselves fundamentally as being able to replace 80+% of every turbine, generator, and engine in the world across market verticals. That's where we're going. But of course, we have to start somewhere, right? That's not a market that we can go attack. And so for us, I keep talking about data centers because that's who's driving the demand right now. So data centers are the ideal customer profile. Hyperscalers have a bit of an edge over co-locators, but they're also very big. And then enterprise depends on the company, but certain enterprise data centers are also good opportunities for us, although they're kind of dying. Um, and heavy industrials are kind of right behind them there because as data centers gobble up more and more of the available stock of, let's call it behind the meter power generation turbines, especially, it is heavy industrials left holding the bag because they already have these things on site. They're already using them. And now all of a sudden they're not available for new builds or for expansion. And so those are really where we're headed right now. Initial deployments will be kind of all over the map. So before we get to that size, we'll do some pilot work both on those customer classes, but we also are doing some utility pilot work already. We're doing some developer pilot work already. We'll likely also be into, bespoke markets like stranded natural gas, flare off gas, American Indian reservations. So there's really a lot of opportunity. And it is centered around the people who are power constrained today because of their lack of access to traditional turbines and generators. And then once they have a little bit of Petra Power in their life, their costs are so low, they're never going back to the 1800s with combustion tech.
Yeah, you touch on a lot of great ideas there. As we head towards the finish line of the podcast, I'd love to get your perspective on where you see your strategic priorities in the next 6 to 12 months, but then also maybe a bigger vision of the entire industry, which we could call renewables, but energies. There's, power fits into all of those segments. So where you see that headed, in this decade?
So speaking very broadly about energy, we will see success from next gen nuclear in this decade. Whether or not it will be fast enough to keep up with where China's at right now is a totally different question, but we will see some success from next gen nuclear. I don't expect we see fusion on the grid this decade. What we will see at the macro level is changes in our distribution, I think, is the most primary. So we'll see a lot of changes in generation. We'll see a lot of new generation, right? So you ask about renewables. Solar's LCOE today is in certain markets better than anything else. Now, there's a storage problem and there's a battery problem. So I'm not saying these things are solved, but they'll continue to be driven by market forces. And so solar had this big renaissance before it was ready. And then there's a public wave against it a little bit, but now it's actually in a really good spot. And I do expect that we'll see in certain markets specifically an uptick in things like solar. Wind, I think, is increasingly incompatible with the nature of power generation that we're looking for. So there's still some great places to run it, especially some certain offshore places. But in general, we're not seeing the same gains in LCOE for wind that we saw in solar. Geothermal has its place in, again, very specific markets. Like you can't just drill a geothermal well anywhere in the world. There's very specific places that it works, but we're not at that threshold yet. And so I do think we still see more. Turbines are getting better, which is great. Linear turbines and linear generators are having a bit of a moment right now. They're an improvement for sure. But I think we eat that entire asset class. We eat all of the fuel to electricity as we move into the future here. And so I think that the future on the distribution side looks like nuclear as the primary source of uninterruptible large scale power. It looks like Petra Power doing all or most of the fuel to electricity, regardless of what that fuel is. And that's a very specific class within the energy balance that makes up 60-ish%. And then we will still have renewable deployments, especially solar in certain markets paired with battery storage for now. I also don't think we solve things like hydrogen storage and transport in the next decade. But I say all of this and give kind of a very stock answer today that it is hard to make prediction. It's harder to make predictions now than it ever has been about tech development because the pace of AI and language model development is unprecedented. The type of complex questions that we might be able to ask a sophisticated model in the next 3 years could be far beyond what my expectations are. And that's, hand up, that could be the case. But where the biggest change I think is going to come is in distribution. And there's kind of two ways to look at this. One is the very obvious, increasingly perceptive element of the national grid, which is extremely weak. It's a huge national security vulnerability and we have huge losses through it. So we could add gigawatts of capacity if we eliminated transmission loss on the grid. Now, that's physically impossible to do without superconductors, and the energy cost of putting superconducting conduit in would be way higher than the savings from the loss. But we are recognizing this now more and more, and the loss on transmission is scales with the length of the transmission. And so more localized transmission, which also meets nuclear, by the way, and meets our kind of modular distributed deployable system. So we're both building towards this space. I think that we're going to see a lot more of that. And it doesn't necessarily look like ERCOT in Texas, which is not truly distributed. ERCOT's just deregulated. It's a common misconception I see outside the energy space. But true distributed systems, I think, is coming. The other element of this, because it's in the news quite a bit right now, is this idea of power generation from space. And so, the classic like sci-fi idea is like a Dyson sphere around the sun, whatever. We're not seeing that in the next decade. And I'm not sure we're ever seeing it because then there's, the universe and our solar system in particular. And this is really my background. This is what I like the most, but like, it's a complex ecosystem and harnessing a ton of energy from the sun may seem kind of harmless, but it certainly is not. But we may see things like there is a company, and certainly they were running before. I think they're still running that, is trying to put like big mirrors into space to reflect solar power and get a higher concentration on Earth. That's an example of transmission. It's a unique example, but we hear Elon Musk talking about data centers in space right now. And, there's a lot of reasons it makes sense. It's 0 Kelvin. You don't need to cool them, whatever. There's a lot of things people aren't talking about that are an issue, but that's a problem for a different time. But if that is somehow able to be proven, and again, it's driven by market need, it's not driven by some sci-fi like curiosity. If that's able to be proven, I think we do potentially see a renaissance in wireless electricity transmission in the next decade. And that's a little bit of an out there concept, but it got a ton of play early in the decade, and we kind of just said it's not worth it. But as launch costs go down significantly, I think that and again, we're kind of land mitigated in energy production on Earth. If we're able to see someone prove concept for very selfish reasons, I think is the only way it would happen. Again, that's the idea with like XAI is the one who needs the power in space. Then we might see a renaissance of wireless transmission from space. And then we might be able to do a whole host of other things like solar sails and, solar panels in space. And again, people, I think, see that as a panacea solution, which it absolutely is not. It comes with all sorts of other issues. But I wouldn't be surprised if we also see things move in that direction over the next 10 years or so.
Wow, you really touched on a lot of different concepts there. We could have a podcast on any one of those topics and go deep into it. With that, I see how Petra Power is really well positioned to be part of the solution and also driving forth a number of those pillars as we move towards an increased energy consumption in the future, but also needing to supply that consumption. So I think you guys are really well positioned. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Aaron, for our guests that may want to follow your work, get a hold of you directly, how best to follow up?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because we are really just starting to make ourselves kind of public after a long time doing undercover work for the DoD, so to speak, not in the real sense, but a little bit of stealth. You can find us at petrapower.com. If you shoot an email there, I will likely see it at some point. You can also find us on LinkedIn, reach out to us there. But there's a lot more coming. I've got some more long form thoughts on a lot of these topics that I'll be putting out over the coming months here and really trying to start spreading the word. These are really, really important ideas, and they're at the center of our need as a market and as a society today, but also our desire to continue advancing forward as a species. Energy is at the center of all of that. And so a lot more coming. Find us on, petrapower.com. Find us on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Probably more coming on other socials, but I don't have them up yet. So just stay tuned and follow along where you can find us today. Always happy to take inbound from folks if there's interest.
Cool. And for our audience, of course, I'll put those details in the show notes so you can check it out. If you've enjoyed the show, make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and reach out to Aaron if you'd like to continue the conversation. Aaron, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to present and tell us all about what you got going on in the world. It's been very enjoyable. Any final words to our audience before we say goodbye?
Go try to do hard things. We need more people in America building really important solutions to really hard problems. And so if you've got an idea, don't be afraid. Go try to do something hard. And thank you again, Kreel, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well said. Okay, that's another wrap for Blue Ocean Solutions podcast. We'll see you on the next one.